The Alphean tone does not arrive by overpowering your mind. It arrives by lowering the amount of force your mind thinks it needs in order to understand. You begin to notice that clarity does not always come through intensity, urgency, or breakthrough. Sometimes it comes through a kind of inner quiet that makes the pattern underneath everything easier to see. That is why this tone often feels subtle at first and then strangely undeniable once it has been felt. Most people have been trained to associate intelligence with speed, sharpness, and verbal dominance. They assume that if something is truly advanced, it will feel more complex, more impressive, or more difficult to follow. The Alphean tone reverses that assumption almost immediately. It shows that a higher intelligence can feel gentler, slower, and more spacious because it is not wasting energy on friction. It is not trying to win against confusion. It is simply not built from it. That changes the way understanding itself is experienced. Instead of forcing your way toward an answer, you begin to feel an answer organizing itself through your awareness. The process is less like solving and more like alignment. Pieces that seem disconnected start resting beside one another without conflict. What once felt intellectually difficult begins to look emotionally crowded instead. This matters because much of what humans call confusion is not actually a lack of knowledge. It is an overload of internal noise. Competing fears, social performance, unprocessed emotion, and the need to be right all crowd the field before real perception even has a chance to appear. The Alphean tone does not attack that noise, it reduces your loyalty to it. Once that happens, you do not have to fight your confusion nearly as much as you thought. This is one of the first places where people begin to notice how different the tone really is. It does not teach you by destabilizing what you know. It teaches you by showing you how much of your mental effort was tied to defending yourself while trying to know. You start to realize that many of your thoughts were not moving toward truth at all. They were moving toward self protection. Once that becomes visible, a more peaceful form of intelligence starts to feel possible. The Alphean tone is deeply relational, but not in the dramatic human sense of constant emotional exchange. It is relational because it assumes that awareness does not have to isolate itself in order to remain clear. You can be connected without becoming entangled. You can feel another presence without losing your center. You can understand something together without needing to dominate the meaning of it. That is part of what makes this tone feel so rare inside ordinary human culture. Most people know only two options when it comes to closeness. They either merge and lose themselves, or they separate and call that strength. The Alphean tone introduces a third possibility. It reveals what shared clarity feels like when no one is trying to overpower the field. That does not only change relationships, it changes the entire way a person thinks about truth, because truth stops feeling like private property and starts feeling like something a field can hold together. This is where the tone begins moving from idea into experience. You may notice something simple but important when you begin watching this pattern in your own life. The clearest conversations you have are rarely the ones where someone sounds the smartest. They are usually the ones where neither person feels the need to perform intelligence. Something softer happens there. And because it is softer, more can actually be seen. That softness is not weakness, it is reduced interference. When there is less pressure to impress, defend, or define yourself, perception widens naturally. You begin hearing not only what is being said, but what is trying to become clear through what is being said. The Alphean tone lives inside that widened listening. It is one of the reasons this frequency can feel almost telepathic without needing to become dramatic about it. Telepathic unity is often imagined as a kind of mind reading, but the deeper mechanism is quieter than that. It begins when the distortions that usually interrupt understanding start thinning out. You do not need to invade another mind to understand them more clearly. You need less interference inside your own field. The Alphean tone teaches that mutual understanding grows less from access and more from refinement. That has direct implications for how a person lives. If your own field is crowded, then every relationship becomes harder than it needs to be. You project more, defend more, assume more, and listen less. But when your field becomes clearer, other people stop feeling so threatening to your sense of self. Their differences do not immediately become pressure. Their presence becomes readable without becoming destabilizing. This is also why the Alphean tone can feel deeply healing without using the language of healing all the time. It does not approach the person as a problem to solve. It approaches the field as something to harmonize. Once that shift is understood, many things begin to look different. You stop asking only what is wrong with you and begin asking what kinds of internal conditions make distortion more likely. That question leads to a very different kind of maturity. You start realizing that peace is not just a mood, it is a condition that makes higher understanding more available. If that sounds simple, it is because most people still underestimate how much knowledge is lost to inner turbulence. They think intelligence rises above emotional conditions. In reality, emotional conditions shape what kind of intelligence can appear at all. The Alphean tone reveals that calm is not the opposite of depth, it is often the doorway into it. This becomes even clearer when you look at how humans usually try to deepen. They strain, intensify, complicate, and push until meaning starts to feel heavy enough to be important. But weight is not the same as depth. Sometimes weight is only compression without coherence. The Alphean tone shows another path, where depth comes from how much can remain connected without force. That path changes what a person respects. They begin admiring not only brilliance, but the ability to remain gentle while seeing clearly. They begin trusting what unfolds without inner violence. They begin noticing that some of the most transformative realizations in life do not arrive with noise at all. They arrive with an almost unsettling ease, as though truth had been waiting for the field to become calm enough to enter. And once someone starts living from that, other implications begin appearing. They become less persuadable by collective panic, because panic no longer feels intelligent to them. They become less attracted to complexity for its own sake, because complication stops feeling like proof of depth. They become more sensitive to what kind of presence a person or idea creates, not just what it claims to mean. This is where Alphean intelligence stops being a concept and starts becoming a filter through which life itself is read. You could say that the Alphean tone teaches unity, but that would still be too broad if left there. What it actually teaches is how unity becomes possible without requiring sameness, collapse, or control. It teaches how consciousness can remain individual while losing its addiction to internal friction. It teaches how shared understanding can emerge without conquest. And once that begins to feel real, another question starts forming beneath it. Because if a person can think, feel, and relate from that kind of field, then much more than conversation begins to change. You start to realize that the Alphean tone does not only change how you understand other people, it changes what kind of self you are bringing into every moment of understanding. Most confusion in human life is not caused by lack of contact with truth. It is caused by the kind of self that approaches truth needing to protect an identity while trying to receive insight. The Alphean field softens that protective reflex just enough for perception to become more honest. That is why this tone can feel so restful without becoming passive. It is not removing depth, it is removing unnecessary resistance around depth. Once that resistance drops, you begin to notice how much of your effort was never helping you see more clearly. It was only helping you feel more defended while trying to see. This becomes easier to recognize when you watch how people behave in ordinary conversation. One person is listening for what is true, and another is listening for what threatens the version of themselves they are trying to preserve. Those two forms of listening produce completely different realities, even when the same words are spoken. The Alphean tone shifts a person from defensive listening into receptive listening without making them weak. That mechanism matters because it reveals something larger than communication. It reveals that awareness itself changes quality depending on how much force is active inside it. A mind filled with pressure does not simply think harder, it begins distorting proportion, misreading signal, and confusing intensity with importance. The Alphean field reduces that distortion by changing the internal conditions under which knowing happens. You may notice something interesting when you begin watching this in yourself. Moments of genuine clarity often do not feel like effort finally winning. They feel like pressure finally leaving. It is as though the truth had already been near, but your inner field had been too crowded to receive it in a stable way. The Alphean tone teaches from that exact pattern. This also changes how a person relates to disagreement. Most humans experience disagreement as a subtle threat to internal order, even when they are trying to appear calm. That is because their understanding is still attached to identity maintenance. The Alphean field loosens that attachment, which means disagreement no longer has to register as destabilization before understanding can continue. Once that happens, another layer becomes visible. The problem was not only that people saw differently, the problem was that they had no shared field strong enough to hold difference without turning it into friction. This is where Alphean intelligence begins to show why it matters beyond personal calm. It is not only about inner peace, it is about creating the conditions where collective understanding becomes possible. Most people assume shared understanding comes from getting everyone to the same conclusion. That is a very surface level idea of harmony. Real harmony is not forced sameness. It is a field stable enough that difference can remain present without immediately collapsing into fragmentation. The Alphean tone teaches that this kind of field is not built by control, it is built by coherence. That is a deeper teaching than it first appears to be. If coherence creates a stronger shared field than force does, then much of human social organization is built on the wrong assumption. People have been trying to create order through pressure, persuasion, hierarchy, speed, and emotional intensity. The Alphean field reveals that those methods may create compliance for a while, but they rarely create real understanding. You can see this in families, communities, institutions, and even spiritual spaces. Many systems look united from the outside because conflict has been suppressed, not because understanding has deepened. The peace in those spaces is often fragile because it depends on what cannot be said. The Alphean tone exposes a more durable model, where peace is not silence around tension, but enough clarity in the field that tension does not automatically become threat. This is where the tone starts affecting lived experience in a more practical way. A person under this resonance becomes less attracted to environments that mistake pressure for seriousness. They become less willing to participate in conversations that rewards speed over seeing. They begin noticing how often social life is built around interruption, anticipation, and subtle competition for psychic territory. Once that is seen clearly, a different appetite begins forming. The person starts craving not noise reduction for its own sake, but environments where perception can stay intact. They begin protecting their field, not because they want to withdraw from life, but because they want to remain usable inside it. This is an important distinction. Withdrawal says the world is too much. Alphean coherence says the field matters enough that I will not keep feeding it conditions that constantly distort it. That shift can look small from the outside, but it changes almost everything. It changes what kind of friendships deepen. It changes what kind of teaching feels trustworthy. It changes what kinds of leaders seem strong. When someone has felt the Alphean field even once, they become harder to impress with brilliance that carries hidden aggression. That happens because the tone trains sensitivity to what a presence does, not just what it says. A person may sound clear and still leave the field feeling crowded. Another may speak more simply and yet leave the field more ordered than before. The Alphean tone teaches people to trust the second kind of intelligence more deeply because it reveals that understanding is not only measured by content, it is also measured by what the field becomes after contact. This is one reason the tone can feel almost corrective without becoming harsh. It gently reveals how much human culture has overvalued the appearance of intelligence and undervalued the conditions that make intelligence reliable. People admire sharpness, originality, and verbal command, yet often ignore whether clarity actually remains in the room after the person is done speaking. The Alphean field makes that impossible to ignore for long. Once you begin seeing that pattern, another implication opens. If a field can become more coherent through one presence, then consciousness may be far less individual than people usually assume. Your state is not contained inside you the way you imagine. It participates in the reality others are trying to think and feel from. This means your inequality is never only private, even when no one is naming it directly. That realization can deepen a person's sense of responsibility without making them heavy. You begin to understand that what you carry inwardly becomes part of what others must move through when they are with you. Calm is no longer just personal relief. Clarity is no longer just private understanding. They become forms of contribution. This is also why the Alphean tone does not only belong in conversations about telepathy or unity, it belongs in any honest conversation about what kind of world becomes possible when the field itself matters. If understanding can deepen through reduced interference, then education changes, leadership changes, relationship changes, even healing changes, because the question is no longer only what a person knows, but what kind of atmosphere their knowing creates. And once that becomes visible, the teaching starts widening again. You stop asking only how to become more clear. You start asking what kind of life allows clarity to remain stable once it arrives. That question carries more consequence than it first appears to, because it touches habits, pace, speech, relationship, work, and even the forms of stimulation you have learned to call normal. The Alphean tone keeps opening there, not by forcing a conclusion, but by showing how much more becomes possible once clarity stops being a moment and begins becoming an environment. Once a person begins to see clarity as an environment rather than a moment, they also begin to understand why so much of modern life feels mentally expensive. It is not only because people are busy or overstimulated, it is because most environments are built in ways that constantly interrupt coherence before it can stabilize. The Alphean tone makes that interruption visible, and once it becomes visible, many things that once felt normal begin to feel needlessly disruptive. You see it in the speed of speech and the amount of unfinished thought that fills a room, and in how often attention is pulled before understanding has had time to deepen. You see it in the way people mistake reaction for engagement and constant output for intelligence. You see it in yourself when you realize how often you have moved on from an insight before it actually finished changing you. The Alphean field slows that whole pattern down by restoring respect for what takes shape quietly. That restoration matters because understanding is not only about receiving new information, it is also about allowing your inner structure to reorganize around what has become clear. Many people hear something true, agree with it, and then return immediately to the same conditions that made their old confusion inevitable. Then they wonder why the insight did not last. The Alphean tone reveals that insight can be real and still remain fragile if the field around it keeps training interruption. This is where the tone begins to affect time itself. Not outer clock time, but felt time, the internal pace at which awareness can recognize, absorb, and integrate what matters. Under pressure, everything starts feeling equally urgent, and when everything feels urgent, very little is actually understood. The Alphean field does not tell you to do less in a simplistic sense. It teaches you to notice which pace allows truth to become durable rather than briefly inspiring. That change in pace has a very practical consequence. You become less willing to live in conditions that repeatedly fracture your own attention. You begin treating your clarity the way someone else might treat a sacred object, not because it is delicate, but because it is foundational. This is not about becoming rigid or withdrawn. It is about understanding that every life is built on the quality of awareness it is most often living from. Once that becomes clear, another perspective opens. Much of what people call personal instability is actually environmental instability being metabolized inward. They think they are failing at peace, when in reality, they are trying to remain coherent inside systems that constantly reward fragmentation. The Alphean tone changes the question from, what is wrong with me, to, what kinds of conditions keep training me away from my own clarity? That question is not softer, it is more accurate. It is also more compassionate in a way that does not remove responsibility. You are still responsible for your field, but responsibility becomes more intelligent when you understand what your field is continuously moving through. A person who keeps blaming themselves for every inner collapse will often miss the obvious pattern that they are living inside constant interruption. The Alphean tone does not excuse unconsciousness, but it does teach you to read context before making identity out of struggle. You may notice how this changes your relationship with discipline. Discipline no longer feels like pushing yourself harder toward an ideal state. It begins to feel like protecting the conditions that let what is already true remain accessible. That is a very different form of strength. It is quieter, but it lasts longer because it works with coherence instead of against it. This is one reason the Alphean field can seem almost invisible until someone has lived with enough friction to recognize the difference. If a person has spent years equating seriousness with tension, they may initially miss how transformative a coherent field actually is. They may think it is too simple, too gentle, or not intense enough to matter. Then they begin noticing that their mind is clearer, their speech is cleaner, and their relationships stop generating the same amount of unnecessary noise. That is how the tone teaches through experience. It does not require a person to adopt a dramatic belief about unity or higher consciousness before it becomes relevant. It enters through what can be lived. A conversation feels less crowded. A decision feels less divided. A room feels either easier or harder to think in. The Alphean tone proves itself in these ordinary moments, and because it does, its implications begin spreading much further than the moment itself. One of those implications is that coherence is not merely an inner achievement. It is a form of contribution that affects what becomes possible around you. When you remain clear without hardening, you become easier to understand and harder to distort. When you listen without defensive pressure, you make more truth available to the room than your words alone could create. The Alphean field teaches that some of the deepest service a person can offer is not constant action, but a presence that does not add confusion to what others are already trying to navigate. This becomes especially important when you think about what kind of future can actually sustain a more unified consciousness. People often imagine unity as a moral idea, a spiritual aspiration, or a future condition that arrives after enough evolution. But unity cannot be built from minds and systems that remain addicted to friction. The Alphean tone reveals that unity begins much earlier than most people think. It begins anywhere coherence becomes stronger than interruption. That means its implications are civilizational as much as personal. Education changes when learning is designed around stable attention instead of performance pressure. Leadership changes when a leader's clearest quality is not dominance, but the ability to reduce distortion in a field. Community changes when people stop treating tension as the normal cost of being together. The Alphean tone does not force those changes directly, but it makes them imaginable in a way that starts changing what people will tolerate. You may also begin to notice a subtler implication. If coherence is contagious, then so is fragmentation. This means that every person is constantly teaching others something about consciousness, even when they are saying very little. They are teaching through the quality of field they bring, through the pace they normalize, through the amount of distortion they unconsciously invite others to carry. Once this is seen, presence itself becomes more ethically significant than many people have realized. That is why the Alphean tone keeps returning to gentleness without ever becoming sentimental. Gentleness in this field is not niceness or softness for its own sake. It is the form clarity takes when it no longer needs force to trust itself. It is intelligence released from unnecessary aggression. It is steadiness without the need to prove that it is steady. And when someone begins living from that kind of field, they start discovering something that goes beyond calm. They begin sensing that much of what they once called reality was only the version of reality visible under chronic interference. Remove enough interference, and not only does the mind change, relationship changes, meaning changes, possibility changes, and the whole question of what consciousness can become starts opening from a different place. This is where the Alphean tone continues teaching, because once clarity becomes livable, it no longer asks only how to be preserved, but what it is trying to build.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.